Hi there, my name is Larry Glover, and I'd like to welcome you out into the aspen forest here, where I'd like to share with you some thoughts around what I would call discovering a literacy of meaning and wholeness through nature. This is my intention is to create a really brief synopsis here of a workshop presentation that I did recently at the Positive Global Vision of Healing and Flourishing through Meeting Conference in Toronto. And as much as I've tried to script what I might say in this brief thing here, it's just not going to work. So I'm going to have to fumble my way through and try to share with you the essence of what I mean by this, discovering a literacy of meaning and why I think it's important in today's world. So to go straight to the heart of this literacy of meaning piece for me is I mean to suggest that meaning has a structure and an origin, a flow and a purpose in our lives, a dynamic. And that we come to be able to understand this is critical in today's world. The literacy of meaning gives us an entryway into discerning the nature of our own lives and what it is to be a self in the world, what it actually is to be a human in the world. Because today's world is filled with those who would take advantage of our life's meaning and would give us meaning and purpose. They would hand it to us as consumers so that we might buy their products. And they're using all kinds of neurological research and programming and software and technology and in order to understand the very functioning of our brains so that they can more effectively market their meaning to us and so that we might take on and live out in our own lives and our own being the meaning that they would have for us. There's a great little poem from Rumi where he suggests that there are two kinds of intelligence. And one is an inherited kind of intelligence. It's the kind of learning we get in school and in education and should not be dismissed outright by any means. But there's another kind of intelligence, and I suggest there's another kind of meaning as well. And Rumi speaks of it as a spring, overflowing the spring box in our hearts. And that's the kind of meaning that I want to use this brief little presentation to point towards. I was, near as I can figure, 9 years old when I first cursed God and life and thought it had no meaning, or that whatever meaning life had, it was evil and should not be. And I lay in a pile of leaves behind the preacher's house where we lived, and I thought about how I could take the rope that was in the garage and hang myself from a beam. And I've been a student of meaning ever since. And I'd like to share with you the piece that I would call biotropism, that I think of as it's the turning towards life. It's the piece that saved me, and it was a turning towards nature, as a restoration of the human soul that I believe is critical to this time for us on the planet. And I want to finally suggest here before moving on to the next slide that inside of me, inside of you, as there is inside of this aspen grove that I sit in the midst of, there is an ancient being alive inside each of us. And it's turning towards this deep, interior, ancient knowledge that I want to point us towards. And actually, here's a quote from Thomas Berry, where he's the Catholic theologian, historian, cosmologist, where he says, we must go far beyond any transformation of contemporary culture. We must go back to the genetic imperative from which human cultures emerge originally, and from which they can never be separated without losing their integrity and their survival capacity. None of our existing cultures can deal with this situation out of its own resources. We must invent or reinvent a substantial, a sustainable human culture by descent into our pre-rational, our instinctive resources. Our cultural resources have lost their integrity. They cannot be trusted. What is needed is not transcendence, but inscendence. Not the brain, but the gene. And I'd like you to share with me this brief journey into that territory. Now, I love this cartoon by Bizarro, where the climber asks, "What is the meaning of life?" And the guru sitting on top of the mountain asks, "Did you check out my page on Facebook?" You know, it's this tendency that we've inherited in the Western culture, and not us alone, but to look outside of ourselves for answers to the meaning of life, to look outside ourselves for orientation, for the answers to the question even of who we are and what brings me joy in life. It is an inherited cultural propensity. And self-determination theorists that I find myself very aligned to, because they align so closely and perfectly actually with what I call wild resiliency. So through this research in self-determination and in human motivation, they found that people often orient towards an externalized or an exterior, or they would call an extrinsic motivation, where they're getting from outside themselves someplace the answers to their living, versus an intrinsic, or what I would call a wild. Because what is wild in life is loyal first and foremost to itself and to its own nature. And so this wildness that lives inside of each of us knows our own joy in the way that nature, that these trees know how to move towards water and nutrition and sunlight. And and so how do we come again as human beings to come back to this place? And I love this cartoon, which, okay, I'll admit they're kind of cute, one bear says to the other, but I still say their herd needs to be thinned. We live in an era where we are moving towards and anticipating 10 billion people on the planet. And never before has life itself on the planet been so challenged. We live in the era of what some call the sixth great extinction. We're losing species at rates that have not been seen on the planet since the extinction of the dinosaurs in that era. And the very flourishing of life on the planet is in question, let alone the flourishing of human life. And I suggest that this, as E.O. Wilson says, biophilia, the innate affinity for life, for nature, for this turning towards what we might call the green brain inside of us again. It's an innate instinctual move in this time, and it well deserves our attention because it's captured well in this population chart, where from 10,000 BC we can see up until even the last 100 years or so, and then even in the last 50 years, how human population is just rising off the charts and skyrocketing. And so in this is the human challenge, where it is time for us to ask this question: what is it to be human? Which of course has its corollary in this question of who am I? And what is the self? Who is the self? And what is it to be a self? And I want to point us today towards what I would call the ecological self. And I love this quote by Gregory Bateson, who says, "The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think." And it is only through a discrepancy between the way that nature works and the way that we think that would allow us to grow in population as we are, that would allow us to grow into the technological realms that we are without asking the question also of how do these relate to nature and to sustainability? How do they serve life? How do they serve the flourishing and the sustainability of life? The very cleverness that got us here as human beings is also the cleverness that can take us out. And it will not be through our cleverness that we discover what it is to flourish as humanity and as individuals collectively on the planet. So again, here we see, on the one hand, what Joseph Campbell would call the right-hand path, the rubber ball. I should switch these slides, maybe. So, which I think of as domesticated resiliency. It's the acculturated self. It is the what some call a false self system. And it has its limitations. It doesn't operate in the way that nature does, and it will inevitably come unraveled. And on the other hand, here's the tree growing out of the rock, cracking open the boulder. My old friend on his 90th birthday who said, speaking of when he first saw this tree some 50 years ago up in the Pecos Mountains near where I live, he said, you know, Larry, when I first started coming up here, that tree was little and that rock was big. And now that rock is big, or now that rock is little and that tree is big. So there's this piece where life wants to happen, and it lives inside of each of us, and it's an innate pull towards our own wholeness, and it's an innate pull within inside each of us towards a meaning that fits for us in life. Meaning and personal meaning serve the just and the unjust equally, like the rain of the biblical Job. If you think of Hitler, if you think of Osama bin Laden, if you think of Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa, each of them were served by the personal meaning in their lives equally. And yet I suspect the personal meaning that for the latter two arose out of their hearts in a way that is different than the personal meaning that was derived from Osama bin Laden or Hitler in an exterior way that was fueled by fear and anger, if not even hatred. And so these are our choices in today's world. And I'd like to point us towards some iconic images of wholeness as we think about the self here and what it is to be human, what it is to be a self. The first iconic image I'm sitting in, the aspen grove and the aspen tree. And this is a picture of an aspen sort of at the edge of a ponderosa pine area taken by a friend of mine in full moonlight. And it's this beauty, this sensuality that lives inside of our bodies that I mean to point us towards. It is a coming to our senses, a return to our senses, to the affinity we have, that meaning that is inside of us, that we each can hear when we step into that place or in nature that we love. It doesn't speak English. It speaks a language older than words, and it speaks to the cellular structures inside of our bodies when we go out into the forest or into nature, and we feel ourselves settle in a way that is different than what we feel in a shopping mall. And here is an image of a single aspen tree. This for me represents the woundedness of separation in nature that we feel. The woundedness of the story of separation of Western humanity, the individual self who is alone in the world, who, as I felt it, had to prove myself in the world, and yet I could never be good enough. I could never be enough. There was no way that I could ever earn my living, and yet, or let alone my salvation. And yet, I was forever condemned to try and do those things because of this Western inherited theology and philosophy. What's happening on this aspen tree that you're looking at is these are scars left by an elk. as the elk gnaw the aspens in the winter on their bark for medicine and food. And here's a quote then that is so relevant to this separation and this woundedness that we're talking about, by this fourth grader quoted in The Last Child in the Woods book by Richard Love, where the child says, "I like to play indoors better because that's where all the electrical outlets are." This is where we're heading in part. Richard coined the phrase nature deficit disorder. And I suggest that adults are as susceptible to it as are our children. And yet Lao Tzu says, men are born soft and supple. Dead, they're stiff and hard. Plants are born tender and pliant. Dead, they're brittle and dry. Thus, whoever is soft and yielding is a disciple of life. Whoever is stiff and inflexible is a disciple of death. The soft and supple will prevail. The stiff and inflexible will be broken. It's a translation by Stephen Mitchell of Lao Tzu again. Again, men are soft and supple when they're born, and plants are tender and pliant. And then we have this part of us that grows into the acculturation of our families, the acculturation that society necessarily lays upon us. And in those, as we adapt ourselves to that, we become stiff and inflexible because there's no other way for us to be in that world. If we're to find a personal literacy of meaning and wholeness, then it means turning towards nature again, discovering a biognosis, the knowledge of life. And here's a brief slide of how children lost the right to roam, where the great-grandfather had an area of 6 miles where he roamed through nature, and down to the grandson, who now is allowed to walk on his own to the end of his street, 300 yards. It may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society like ours could choose, in essence, to destroy itself, but that is what we're now in the process of doing. This is a cold, hard sort of reality. I grew up and grew into a tremendous self-destructive being and self as I tried to adapt myself into who I should be, both who my parents wanted me to be and needed me to be, and who society wanted me to be. And it's that kind of adaptation that is driving our prison industries. It's driving our drug industries. It's driving the military-industrial complex and creating wars that we now call endless. I suggest there is another way. And it's captured here in this aspen grove and in an aspen slide. Aspens, you see, can tell us something about the nature of the self and what it truly is to be a self in a way that is far different than the Western story we've inherited and how we've come to think of ourselves. Aspens are a beloved, iconic image wherever they grow. In the West, where I am, they're a major source of tourism and income, and their diversity of life that's within them is on a magnitude of, multiple times that of a pine forest. Their value as a water resource is incredible because of their capacity to hold water is greater than that in a pine forest. And here's from a stamp, I believe in 2006, where aspens were acknowledged as the largest known organism on the planet, as an individual organism. The grove, the entire grove, is connected by a single root system, genetically identical. Pondo in Utah has been estimated to be perhaps 80,000 years old. Some botanists think it could be 1 million years old. Some botanists refer to aspens as the eternal tree. I suggest aspens are an image of the tree of life for this very reason. You got to laugh at me, okay? Because I'm laughing. The quaking aspen in North America here, aspens are the most widely distributed tree in North America, moving down even into Mexico, up into the Arctic areas. And they're also one of the most common 100 trees in the Americas. So I'd like to take you on this journey into the back country a bit, sort of further, sort of like where I'm sitting, which is off trail. So as we get off the road and off the beaten track and off the right-hand path, further back into the left-hand path where fewer people tread, we're going to take a look at aspens in a different way and take a look at the human self in a different way than what we're accustomed to doing. And again, here's another image of what we might call the self. Notice the scars on the aspen tree that we're looking at here. Aspens, you see, have the capacity to drop their branches as other deciduous trees drop their leaves. Aspens will drop a branch when it no longer serves them. Aspens are sun-loving trees, and so when the lower branches no longer can receive the sun they need, then they drop them. What a great skill. I wish I could have that as equally accessible and easily to me. So perhaps if I knew myself more closely to be like the forest, I could obtain some of those skills. And I suggest to you that we are more like the forest, we are more like the aspen than we are different. And here's another view of the aspens, another view of a self. All of these trees being connected by a single root system, all of them coming off of this. So the root system lives throughout ages, maybe hundreds, thousands, a million years, while the top trees, what we see of as and think of as the tree, comes and goes, living 20, 60, maybe 80, 120 years is an old, what botanists would call a rammet, the tree expression. Here you see another expression of a self, this being an image of an aspen grove outside of Santa Fe where I live. This grove coming and arising into this expression from a forest fire that came through this area in the early 1900s. Aspens, you see, are the first tree to come back after fires in the West. And their success as the world's largest known living individual organism is hinged to environmental disruption. Now, don't you think that it would pay humanity to pay attention to such a successful species whose very success is hinged to environmental disruption? When we live in a day and an age when climatic destabilization is considered one of our largest threats to our national security in the United States and globally, which is going to lead to mass human migrations and mass species die-off, perhaps the aspens have something they can tell us and teach us. This is another view of the aspen self. This is a view of a root. And so it's like going down and deep into the depths of this question, what is it to be a self and what is it to be a human? And the rooting body of this body that I'm sitting in, I would remind you that to walk in an aspen grove like this is to walk inside the body of an organism. It's not just an MRI kind of technology. To walk inside of here is to listen to the breeze blowing and to smell the air, the crispness, and it's to touch and feel and taste the greenery of the grass. I was about to eat a dandelion leaf for you here. So the DNA structure in this soil, and a handful of this soil, is denser than the DNA structure, than the density of the DNA in your body, because of the density of the bacteria here. We'll get to this more here in a moment. And here's a picture of Amanita muscara, which is a mushroom that has an affinity for aspens and birches and these populars here. And this is the fruiting body, again, of what lies below the ground. Mushrooms are the sexual organ of a mycelia, of a fungus that lives below ground. So again, they are, the larger organism is again below the ground, unseen to normal eyes that are not aware, not awake. It's time for us to recover what I would call our primal vision, our primal seeing, to see the world again as it is, not as we are just acculturated to see it, not just as we are taught to see it, but to see it as it is. This is the photo of a cover of a book, Mycorrhizal Symbiosis, and the large structures on the root that you see are actually the roots of the Scotch pine, but all those little white structures are the mycorrhizal fungus structure. And to read this in the ectomycorrhizal symbiosis between fungi and trees, the fungus completely ensheathes the tree roots and takes over water and mineral nutrient supply, while the plant supplies photosynthate. Hence, the entire forest can be seen as one biological entity, connected below ground by a wood-wide web of ectomycorrhizal fungi. It's incredible, huh? To think of a whole forest, not just an aspen forest, but to think of a whole forest as an organism. And yet the Western mind is taking that and eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we've come to see in this reductionistic world philosophy, taking everything apart. It's time to recover the vision of wholeness. This is a photo, actually it's a brief little slideshow if I can make it run. I think the light may be too much. But in this you can actually see the mycorrhizal fungi growing and extending, but there's an exchange going on here. These are the nutrients being exchanged between the fungus and the tree. And you look at this rock. This is a rock with lichen, with a photo of lichen on it. It's hard for me to see the screen here, so in the sunlight. And my computer's sitting on a rock with lichen on it. And we look at the lichen here, and it looks like an individual organism, but it's not. It's actually a fungus and a bacteria or an algae and living in mutualistic symbiotic relationship, woven together to appear to the human eye as an individual. But it's not. It's woven of wholes that make a larger whole, woven of selves. Here's a brief TED video that I'd love you to see here. Again, if I can figure out how to make this run. Oh, I'm going to try and go back. This is so cool. No, one more time. There we go. This is worth it. Bonnie Blazer talking about bacteria, how they communicate to each other.
Bacteria are the oldest living organisms on the earth. They've been here for billions of years, and what they are single-celled microscopic organisms. So they're one cell, and they have the special property that they only have one piece of DNA. So they have very few genes and genetic information to encode all of the traits that they carry out. And the way bacteria make a living is that they consume nutrients from the environment, they grow to twice their size, they cut themselves down in the middle, and one cell becomes two, and so on and so on. So they just grow and divide and grow and divide. So kind of boring life, except that what I would argue is that you have an amazing interaction with these critters. I know you guys think of yourself as humans, and this is sort of how I think of you. And so this man is supposed to represent a generic human being, and all of the circles in that man are all of the cells that make up your body. So there's about 1 trillion human cells that make each one of us who we are and able to do all the things that we do. But you have 10 trillion bacterial cells in you or on you at any moment in your life. So 10 times more bacterial cells than human cells on a human being. And so of course it's the DNA that counts. So here's all the A, T, G's, and C's that make up your genetic code and give you all your charming characteristics. So you have about 30,000 genes. Well, it turns out you have 100 times more bacterial genes playing a role in you or on you all of your life. And so At the best, you're 10% human. We're more likely about 1% human, depending on which of these metrics you like. So I know you think of yourself as human beings, but I think of you as 90 or 99.
And the slide changes. So this is this fascinating thing. What is it to be a human when actually the human body is 99% bacteria? Bacterial cells, more bacterial cells in our body than human cells. When was the last time you said thank you to the bacteria in your body? And here's a slide of a deer in the forest. So when we think of a forest, how many trees does it take to make a forest? How many deer does it take? How many squirrels? How many birds does it take to make a forest? And again, aspens in particular have this very rich diversity of life, of biodiversity. This is a photo of a great horned owl taking up a rabbit in the snow. So again, part of the weaving together of nature in any forest and inside of us too is this predator-prey relationship. There are parasites in prey, you know. And again, this all occurs as we're now learning within a larger cooperative frame, where the predator is gifting, you know, in this case, the owl is gifting the rabbit speed, if you will, and the rabbit is gifting the owl agility of flight and hearing. They're woven together. You can't talk of one without the other. You take one out and the other is gone. This is a really brief, I want to just do this thing too, and then I'm going to bring this to a quick close because I got to go too.
These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds. Its infected brain directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head.
So strange.
It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer. There are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species.
Incredible, huh? I suggest to you that this is what it's like to live a life with introjected purpose and meaning in your life. You're told by some outside authority what to be loyal to and how to live your life in a way that is not in accord with your own heart, with your own innate natural joy, with your own innate natural meaning. Fear now is the major parasite on our planet growing in the human brain, in the human body and soul and spirit. It's propagated by many whose interest it is to keep us living in fear. All the messages that we have that we're not enough, that we can never be enough, that you need to go prove yourself in the world, these are all interjected kinds of purpose and meaning in life that throw us off of who we really are and where to find that joy. This is another view of an aspen grove from the lake in a bowl up in the Colorado Rocky Mountain range. When you see this is water is another view of the self. For aspens are water-loving creatures and beings, even as humans are, and require this water. And water we could talk about more, and I will. I'll close with water, but fire is also an important part of the aspens. And so when you see and recover your primal vision, you can look out at an aspen grove such as I'm sitting in, and also see the fire that's here. Because when this wood burns, and it will eventually, as all forests will here in the West, it releases stored sunlight. The fire is the stored sunlight, as is the oil that we burn in our cars. And here we see a butterfly image, and I'd go into this more, but time prevents. So finally, I'd like you to notice the scarring, if you will, on all of these, on the trunks, on the bottom part of the trunks of all of these aspens. These are old, healed over scars from the elk gnawing on this aspen grove, on this self, this individual. But I want to remind you that even though you perhaps carry your story of wounding, of separation, as I have in my life, as being an individual separate self, and we tend to become attached to that story of wounding, and it becomes part of our identity. But it is not who we are. It is something that this being goes through, this experience of being Larry here, if you will, but it is not my deep nature. It's not the deep self. So to recover our primal vision and to turn towards nature and the restoration and discovery of purpose and meaning is to discover that we are more than the wound, more than the experience of separation, and in fact, we're more than the individual leaf. That may be a picture of a self, but it's not the whole self, as is the photo of the branch or a cluster of leaves. This is a picture of a self, but there is also, this is a self within a larger self, as is this image of a self, as is this image of a self within selves, within selves, as is this image of a friend, of a self within another friend of selves. It's an expanding, holistic whole-on within whole-ons. For this too is an image of the self. And it's vital now that we come to see it as such, as is this an image of the self. This image from Hubble is a reminder to me of our birthday today, give or take a few hours, but 14.5 billion years ago, something like that. This great flaring forth and expression of the cosmos that's happening still here and now inside of me and inside of you, inside of all of life. This is not a one-time event and it's over. It's still happening. Cosmogenesis. This is who we are in deeper nature. We're that mystery. This is an image from the National Geographic Project, actually, and it's I'll do this sort of shift from the Atlas of the Human Journey here. From the human genome, we've been able to trace through the mitochondrial DNA the migration of humanity out of Africa back down to mitochondrial Eve. So you take a cheek swab of tissue from yourself and you can send it in. Whoops, go back the wrong way. And you can actually get this image, this map of your own ancestral journey back down into the mitochondrial Eve out of Africa. This is part of the human rooting underground that we're invited to see through the gift of this technology. And I think this is a photograph of an arboglyph in an aspen grove by a Basque sheep herder, probably 70 to 100 years ago now, where he carved into this tree, "God bless my enemy." God bless my enemy, I believe that's what it says. And it's singular, my enemy, on an aspen grove. This is our rooting. This is what the transformation that can come to us and come to humanity, and represents the flourishing that I see through coming to see these iconic images of wholeness in nature. And I love this one. You see all these leaves falling. This happens every year. This is one of the cycles of nature. There's a real lesson to be learned from this. Do you know what it is? Don't be a leaf. Be a tree. Thank you, Peanuts and Lucy. So finally, you should know that that aspens are under threat from global warming, from drought, climatic destabilization, from what's called SAD, sudden aspen decline, a multitude of various kinds of things coming together. In a photograph from the Colorado mountainside where all the aspens are dying off. Utah and Colorado have lost over 50% of their aspens. Arizona's lost over 90% of their aspens. This is the same threat that we are facing as humanity. It's time to wake up. Finally, thank you for sharing this journey down the river of life with me. This little brief interlude into an aspen grove and my perspectives on human flourishing through purpose and meaning, or through turning to nature in relationship to our purpose and meaning, and how we can discover more about what it is to be a human being on the planet. And finally, ocean. Kabir has a great quote where he says something like, millions can see the raindrop in the ocean, but only 1 in a million can see the ocean in a raindrop. Oh, the quote was close, but you get the sentiment of it. And so I invite you to come and see the raindrop inside of you and me, where we come into the world something like 90% water, and we still have that capacity of water to accept whatever is as it is, to know the flexibility of water as our own, as part of who we are as human beings, and to know the care that we give to the water on the planet is the care that we give to ourselves personally, and that there's meaning in that, an innate kind of personal meaning. And the care we give to our forest and to the planet is to take care of ourselves and to turn meaning and wholeness and care and love back on to the wholeness of a self. Thank you.